Chapters 10 through 13 of Foul Play by Charles Reade and Dion Boucicault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 10. The fiddle ended in mid-tune, and the men crowded aft with anxious faces. The captain sounded the well, and found 3 feet and a half water in it. He ordered all hands to the pumps. They turned to with a good heart, and pumped, watch and watch, till daybreak. Their exertions counteracted the leak, but did no more. The water in the well was neither more nor less perceptibly. This was a relief to their minds so far, but the situation was a very serious one. Suppose foul weather should come, and the vessel ship water from above as well? Now all those who were not on the pumps set to work to find out the leak and stop it if possible. With candles in their hands they crept about the ribs of the ship, narrowly inspecting every corner, and applying their ears to every suspected place, if haply they might hear the water coming in. The place where Hazel had found Wiley at work was examined along with the rest, but neither there nor anywhere else could the leak be discovered. Yet the water was still coming in, and required unremitting labor to keep it under. It was then suggested by Wiley, and the opinion gradually gained ground, that some of the seams had opened in the late gale and were letting in the water by small but numerous apertures. Faces began to look cloudy, and Hazel, throwing off his lethargy, took his spell at the main pump with the rest. When his gang was relieved he went away bathed in perspiration, and leaning over the well sounded it. While thus employed the mate came behind him with his cat-like step and said, "See what has come on us with your forebodings. It is the unluckiest thing in the world to talk about losing a ship when she is at sea." "You are a more dangerous man on board a ship than I am," was Hazel's prompt reply. The well gave an increase of 3 inches. Mr. Hazel now showed excellent qualities. He worked like a horse, and finding the mate skulking he reproached him before the men, and stripping himself naked to the waist invited him to do a man's duty. The mate thus challenged complied with a scowl. They labored for their lives, and the quantity of water they discharged from the ship was astonishing, not less than 110 tons every hour. They gained upon the leak only 2 inches. But in the struggle for life this was an immense victory. It was the turn of the tide. A slight breeze sprung up from the southwest, and the captain ordered the men from the buckets to make all sail on the ship, the pumps still going. When this was done, he altered the ship's course and put her right before the wind, steering for the island of Juan Fernandez, distant 1,100 miles or thereabouts. Probably it was the best he could do in that awful waste of water, but its effect on the seamen was bad. It was like giving in. They got a little disheartened and flurried, and the cold, passionless water seized the advantage. It is possible, too, that the motion of the ship through the sea aided the leak. The Proserpine glided through the water all night like some terror-stricken creature, and the incessant pumps seemed to be her poor heart beating loud with breathless fear. At daybreak she had gone 120 miles. But this was balanced by a new and alarming feature. The water from the pumps no longer came up pure, but mixed with what appeared to be blood. This got redder and redder, and struck terror into the more superstitious of the crew. Even Cooper, whose heart was stout, leaned over the bulwarks and eyed the red stream, gushing into the sea from the lee scuppers, and said aloud, "Aye, bleed to death, ye bitch. We shan't be long behind ye." Hazel inquired, and found the ship had a quantity of dye wood among her cargo. He told the men this, and tried to keep up their hearts by his words and his example. He succeeded with some, but others shook their heads. And by, while he was working double tides for them as well as for himself, ominous murmurs met his ear. "Parson aboard! Man aboard, with t'other world in his face!" And there were sinister glances to match. He told this with some alarm to Welch and Cooper. They promised to stand by him, and Welch told him it was all the mate's doings. He had gone among the men and poisoned them. The wounded vessel, with her ever-beating heart, had run 300 miles on the new tack. She had almost ceased to bleed, but what was as bad or worse, Small fragments of her cargo and stores came up with the water, and their miscellaneous character showed how deeply the sea had now penetrated. This, and their great fatigue, began to demoralize the sailors. The pumps and buckets were still plied, but it was no longer with the uniform manner of brave and hopeful men. Some stuck doggedly to their work, but others got flurried and ran from one thing to another. Now and then a man would stop and burst out crying; then to work again in a desperate way. One or two lost heart altogether, and had to be driven. Finally, one or two succumbed under the unremitting labor. Despair crept over others. Their features began to change, so much so that several countenances were hardly recognizable, and each, looking in the other's troubled face, saw his own fate pictured there. 6 feet water in the hold! The captain, who had been sober beyond his time, now got dead drunk. The mate took the command. On hearing this, Welch and Cooper left the pumps. Wiley ordered them back. They refused, and coolly lighted their pipes. A violent altercation took place, which was brought to a close by Welch. "It's no use pumping the ship," said he. "She is doomed. D'ye think we are blind, my mate and me? You got the long boat ready for yourself before ever the leak was sprung. Now get the cutter ready for my mate and me." At these simple words Wiley lost color, and walked aft without a word. Next day there were 7 feet water in the hold, and quantities of bread coming up through the pumps. Wiley ordered the men from the pumps to the boats. The long boat was provisioned and lowered. While she was towing astern, the cutter was prepared, and the ship left to fill. All this time Miss Rolliston had been kept in the dark, not as to the danger, but as to its extent. Great was her surprise when Mr. Hazel entered her cabin and cast an ineffable look of pity on her. She looked up surprised, and then angry. "How dare you?" she began. He waved his hand in a sorrowful but commanding way. "Oh, this is no time for prejudice or temper. The ship is sinking. We are going into the boats. Pray make preparations. Here is a list I have written of the things you ought to take. We may be weeks at sea in an open boat." Then, seeing her dumbfounded, he caught up her carpet bag and threw her work box into it for a beginning. He then laid hands upon some of her preserved meats and marmalade, and carried them off to his own cabin. His mind then flew back to his reading, and passed in rapid review all the wants that men had endured in open boats. He got hold of Welch, and told him to be sure and see there was plenty of spare canvas on board, and sailing needles, scissors, etc. Also 3 bags of biscuit, and above all a cask of water. He himself ran all about the ship, including the mate's cabin, in search of certain tools he thought would be wanted. Then to his own cabin, to fill his carpet bag. There was little time to spare. The ship was low in the water, and the men abandoning her. He flung the things into his bag, fastened and locked it, strapped up his blankets for her use, flung on his pea jacket, and turned the handle of his door to run out. The door did not open. He pushed it. It did not yield. He rushed at it. It was fast. He uttered a cry of rage, and flung himself at it. Horror! It was immovable. 11. The fearful, the sickening truth burst on him in all its awful significance. Some miscreant or madman had locked the door, and so fastened him to the sinking ship at a time when in the bustle, the alarm, the selfishness, all will be apt to forget him and leave him to his death. He tried the door in every way. He hammered at it. He shouted. He raged. He screamed. In vain. Unfortunately, the door of this cabin was of very unusual strength and thickness. Then he took up one of those great augers he had found in the mate's cabin, and bored a hole in the door. Through this hole he fired his pistol, and then screamed for help. "I am shut up in the cabin. I shall be drowned. Oh, for Christ's sake, save me! Save me!" And a cold sweat of terror poured down his whole body. What is that? The soft rustle of a woman's dress? Oh, how he thanked God for that music, and the hope it gave him! It comes toward him. It stops. The key is turned. The dress rustles away, swift as a winged bird. He dashes at the door. It flies open. Nobody was near. He recovered his courage in part, fetched out his bag and his tools, and ran across to the starboard side. There he found the captain lowering Miss Rolliston with due care into the cutter, and the young lady crying; not at being shipwrecked, if you please, but at being deserted by her maid. Jane Holt at this trying moment had deserted her mistress for her husband. This was natural, but, as is the rule with persons of that class, she had done this in the silliest and cruelest way. Had she given half an hour's notice of her intention, Donovan might have been on board the cutter with her and her mistress. But no, being a liar and a fool, she must hide her husband to the last moment, and then desert her mistress. The captain then was comforting Miss Rolliston, and telling her that she should have her maid with her eventually, when Hazel came. He handed down his own bag, and threw the blankets into the stern sheets; then went down himself and sat on the midship thwart. "Shove off," said the captain, and they fell astern. But Cooper, with a boat hook, hooked on to the long boat, and the dying ship towed them both. 5 minutes more elapsed, and the captain did not come down, so Wiley hailed him. There was no answer. Hudson had gone into the mate's cabin. Wiley waited a minute, then hailed again. "Hi, on deck there!" "Hullo!" cried the captain at last. "Why didn't you come in the cutter?" The captain crossed his arms and leaned over the stern. "Don't you know that Hiram Hudson is always the last to leave a sinking ship?" "Well, you are the last," said Wiley, "so now come on board the long boat at once. I dare not tow in her wake much longer, to be sucked in when she goes down." "Come on board your craft and desert my own," said Hudson disdainfully. "Know my duty to m'employers better." These words alarmed the mate. "Curse it all!" he cried. "The fool has been and got some more rum. 50 guineas to the man that will shin up the tow rope and throw that madman into the sea. Then we can pick him up. He swims like a cork." A sailor instantly darted forward to the rope. But unfortunately Hudson heard this proposal, and it enraged him. He got to his cutlass. The sailor drew the boat under the ship's stern, but the drunken skipper flourished his cutlass furiously over his head. "Board me, ye pirates! The first that lays a finger on my bulwarks, off goes his hand at the wrist." Suiting the action to the word, he hacked at the tow rope so vigorously that it gave way, and the boats fell astern. Helen Rolliston uttered a shriek of dismay and pity. "Oh, save him!" she cried. "Make sail!" cried Cooper, and in a few seconds they got all her canvas set upon the cutter. It seemed a hopeless chase for these shells to sail after that dying monster with her cloud of canvas all drawing alow and aloft. But it did not prove so. The gentle breeze was an advantage to light craft, and the dying Proserpine was full of water and could only crawl. After a few moments of great anxiety the boats crept up, the cutter on her port and the long boat on her starboard quarter. Wiley ran forward, and hailing Hudson, implored him in the friendliest tones to give himself a chance; then tried him by his vanity. "Come and command the boats, old fellow. How can we navigate them on the Pacific without you?" Hudson was now leaning over the taffrail, utterly drunk. He made no reply to the mate, but merely waved his cutlass feebly in one hand and his bottle in the other, and gurgled out, "Duty to m'employers." Then Cooper, without a word, double reefed the cutter's mainsail, and told Welch to keep as close to the ship's quarter as he dare. Wiley instinctively did the same, and the three craft crawled on in solemn and deadly silence for nearly 20 minutes. The wounded ship seemed to receive a death blow. She stopped dead, and shook. The next moment she pitched gently forward, and her bows went under the water, while her after part rose into the air, and revealed to those in the cutter 2 splintered holes in her run, just below the water line. The next moment her stern settled down. The sea yawned horribly; the great waves of her own making rushed over her upper deck, and the lofty masts and sails remaining erect, went down with sad majesty into the deep. And nothing remained but the bubbling and foaming of the voracious water that had swallowed up the good ship and her cargo, and her drunken master. All stood up in the boats ready to save him. But either his cutlass sunk him, or the suction of so great a body drew him down. He was seen no more in this world. A loud sigh broke from every living bosom that witnessed that terrible catastrophe. It was beyond words, and none were uttered, except by Cooper, who spoke so seldom. Yet now 3 words of terrible import burst from him, and uttered in his loud, deep voice, rang like the sunk ship's knell over the still bubbling water. "Scuttled, by God!" 12. "Hold your tongue," said Welch, with an oath. Mr. Hazel looked at Miss Rolliston, and she at him. It was a momentary glance, and her eyes sank directly, and filled with patient tears. For the first few minutes after the Proserpine went down, the survivors sat benumbed, as if awaiting their turn to be engulfed. They seemed so little, and the Proserpine so big, yet she was swallowed before their eyes like a crumb. They lost for a few moments all idea of escaping. But true it is that "while there's life there's hope," and as soon as their hearts began to beat again, their eyes roved round the horizon, and their elastic minds recoiled against despair. This was rendered easier by the wonderful beauty of the weather. There were men there who had got down from a sinking ship into boats heaving and tossing against her side in a gale of wind, and yet been saved; and here all was calm and delightful. To be sure, in those other shipwrecks land had been near, and their greatest peril was over once the boats got clear of the distressed ship without capsizing. Here was no immediate peril, but certain death menaced them at an uncertain distance. Their situation was briefly this. Should it come on to blow a gale, these open boats, small and loaded, could not hope to live. Therefore they had 2 chances for life, and no more. They must either make land or be picked up at sea before the weather changed. But how? The nearest known land was the group of islands called Juan Fernandez, and they lay somewhere to leeward, but distant at least 900 miles; and should they prefer the other chance, then they must beat 300 miles and more to windward; for Hudson, underrating the leak as is supposed, had run the Proserpine fully that distance out of the track of trade. Now the ocean is a highway in law; but in fact it contains a few highways and millions of byways; and once a cockleshell gets into those byways, small indeed is its chance of being seen and picked up by any sea-going vessel. Wiley, who was leading, lowered his sail, and hesitated between the 2 courses we have indicated. However, on the cutter coming up with him, he ordered Cooper to keep her head northeast, and so run all night. He then made all the sail he could in the same direction, and soon outsailed the cutter. When the sun went down he was about a mile ahead of her. Just before sunset Mr. Hazel made a discovery that annoyed him very much. He found that Welch had put only 1 bag of biscuit, a ham, a keg of spirit, and a small barrel of water on board the cutter. He remonstrated with him sharply. Welch replied that it was all right; the cutter being small, he had put the rest of her provisions on board the long boat. "On board the long boat?" said Hazel, with a look of wonder. "You have actually made our lives depend upon that scoundrel Wiley again. You deserve to be flung into the sea. You have no forethought yourself, yet you will not be guided by those that have it." Welch hung his head a little at these reproaches. However, he replied rather sullenly, that it was only for 1 night; they could signal the long boat in the morning and get the other bags and the cask out of her. But Mr. Hazel was not to be appeased. "The morning! Why, she sails 3 feet to our 2. How do you know he won't run away from us? I never expect to get within 10 miles of him again. We know him, and he knows we know him." Cooper got up and patted Mr. Hazel on the shoulder soothingly. "Boat hook aft," said he to Welch. He then, by an ingenious use of the boat hook and some of the spare canvas, contrived to set out a studding sail on the other side of the mast. Hazel thanked him warmly. "But, oh, Cooper, Cooper," said he, "I'd give all I have in the world if that bread and water were on board the cutter instead of the long boat." The cutter had now 2 wings instead of 1; the water bubbling loud under her bows marked her increased speed, and all fear of being greatly outsailed by her consort began to subside. A slight sea fret came on and obscured the sea in part; but they had a good lantern and compass, and steered the course exactly all night, according to Wiley's orders, changing the helmsman every 4 hours. Mr. Hazel, without a word, put a rug round Miss Rolliston's shoulders, and another round her feet. "Oh, not both, sir, please," said she. "Am I to be disobeyed by everybody?" said he. Then she submitted in silence, and in a certain obsequious way that was quite new and well calculated to disarm anger. Sooner or later all slept, except the helmsman. At daybreak Mr. Hazel was wakened by a loud hail from a man in the bows. All the sleepers started up. "Long boat not in sight." It was too true. The ocean was blank; not a sail, large or small, in sight. Many voices spoke at once. "He has carried on till he has capsized her." "He has given us the slip." Unwilling to believe so great a calamity, every eye peered and stared all over the sea. In vain. Not a streak that could be a boat's hull, not a speck that could be a sail. The little cutter was alone upon the ocean; alone with scarcely 2 days' provisions, 900 miles from land, and 400 miles to leeward of the nearest sea road. Hazel, seeing his worst forebodings realized, sat down in a moody, bitter, and boding silence. Of the other men some raged and cursed; some wept aloud. The lady, more patient, put her hands together, and prayed to Him who made the sea and all that therein is. Yet her case was the cruelest; for she was by nature more timid than the men, yet she must share their desperate peril. And then to be alone with all these men, and one of them had told her he loved her, and hated the man she was betrothed to. Shame tortured this delicate creature as well as fear. Happy for her that of late, and only of late, she had learned to pray in earnest. Qui precari novit, premi potest, non potest opprimi. It was now a race between starvation and drowning, and either way death stared them in the face. 13. The long boat was, at this moment, 100 miles to windward of the cutter. The fact is that Wiley, the evening before, had been secretly perplexed as to the best course. He had decided to run for the island; but he was not easy under his own decision, and at night he got more and more discontented with it. Finally, at 9:00 p.m., he suddenly gave the order to luff and tack; and by daybreak he was very near the place where the Proserpine went down, whereas the cutter, having run before the wind all night, was at least 100 miles to leeward of him. Not to deceive the reader, or let him for a moment think we do business in monsters, we will weigh this act of Wiley's justly. It was just a piece of iron egotism. He preferred, for himself, the chance of being picked up by a vessel. He thought it was about a hair's breadth better than running for an island, as to whose bearing he was not very clear, after all. But he was not sure he was taking the best or safest course. The cutter might be saved after all, and the long boat lost. Meantime he was not sorry of an excuse to shake off the cutter. She contained one man at least who knew he had scuttled the Proserpine; and therefore it was all important to him to get to London before her and receive the £3,000 which was to be his reward for that abominable act. But the way to get to London before Mr. Hazel, or else to the bottom of the Pacific before him, was to get back into the sea road at all hazards. He was not aware that the cutter's water and biscuit were on board his boat, nor did he discover this till noon next day. And on making this fearful discovery he showed himself human. He cried out with an oath, "What have I done? I have damned myself to all eternity!" He then ordered the boat to be put before the wind again; but the men scowled, and not one stirred a finger; and he saw the futility of this, and did not persist, but groaned aloud, and then sat staring wildly. Finally, like a true sailor, he got to the rum, and stupefied his agitated conscience for a time. While he lay drunk at the bottom of the boat his sailors carried out his last instructions, beating southward right in the wind's eye. 5 days they beat to windward, and never saw a sail. Then it fell dead calm, and so remained for 3 days more. The men began to suffer greatly from cramps, owing to their number and confined position. During the calm they rowed all day, and with this and a light westerly breeze that sprung up, they got into the sea road again. But having now sailed 350 miles to the southward, they found a great change in the temperature. The nights were so cold that they were fain to huddle together, to keep a little warmth in their bodies. On the 15th day of their voyage it began to rain and blow, and then they were never a whole minute out of peril. Hand forever on the sheet, eye on the waves, to ease her at the right moment; and with all this care the spray eternally flying half way over the mast, and often a body of water making a clean breach over her, and the men bailing night and day with their very hats, or she could not have lived an hour. At last, when they were almost dead with wet, cold, fatigue, and danger, a vessel came in sight and crept slowly up, about 2 miles to windward of the distressed boat. With the heave of the waters they could see little more than her sails, but they ran up a bright bandana handkerchief to their masthead, and the ship made them out. She hoisted Dutch colors and continued her course. Then the poor abandoned creatures wept and raved and cursed in their frenzy, glaring after that cruel, shameless man who could do such an act, yet hoist a color, and show of what nation he was the native, and the disgrace. But one of them said not a word. This was Wiley. He sat shivering, and remembered how he had abandoned the cutter and all on board. Loud sighs broke from his laboring breast, but not a word. Yet one word was ever present to his mind, and seemed written in fire on the night of clouds, and howled in his ears by the wind: Retribution. And now came a dirty night to men on ships, a fearful night to men in boats. The sky black, the sea on fire with crested billows that broke over them every minute; their light was washed out, their provisions drenched and spoiled; bail as they would, the boat was always filling. Up to their knees in water, cold as ice, blinded with spray, deafened with roaring billows, they tossed and tumbled in a fiery foaming hell of waters, and still, though despairing, clung to their lives, and bailed with their hats unceasingly. Day broke, and the first sight it revealed to them was a brig to windward staggering along, and pitching under close reefed topsails. They started up and waved their hats and cried aloud; but the wind carried their voices to leeward, and the brig staggered on. They ran up their little signal of distress, but still the ship staggered on. Then the miserable men shook hands all round, and gave themselves up for lost. But at this moment the brig hoisted a vivid flag all stripes and stars, and altered her course a point or two. She crossed the boat's track a mile ahead, and her people looked over the bulwarks, and waved their hats to encourage those tossed and desperate men. Having thus given them the weather gauge, the brig hove to for them. They ran down to her and crept under her lee; down came ropes to them, held by friendly hands, and friendly faces shone down at them. Eager grasps seized each as he went up the ship's side, and so in a very short time they sent the woman up, and the rest being all sailors and clever as cats, they were safe on board the whaling brig Maria, Captain Slocum of Nantucket, U.S. Their log, compass, and instruments were also saved. The boat was cast adrift, and was soon after seen bottom upward on the crest of a wave. The good Samaritan in command of the Maria supplied them with dry clothes out of the ship's stores, good food, and medical attendance, which was much needed, their legs and feet being in a deplorable condition, and their own surgeon crippled. A southeasterly gale induced the American skipper to give Cape Horn a wide berth, and the Maria soon found herself 3 degrees south of that perilous coast. There she encountered field ice. In this labyrinth they dodged and worried for 18 days, until a sudden chop in the wind gave the captain a chance, of which he promptly availed himself, and in 40 hours they sighted Terra del Fuego. During this time the rescued crew, having recovered from the effects of their hardships, fell into the work of the ship, and took their turns with the Yankee seamen. The brig was short handed, but now trimmed and handled by a full crew with the Proserpine's men, who were first class seamen and worked with a will, because work was no longer a duty, she exhibited a speed the captain had almost forgotten was in the craft. Now speed at sea means economy, for every day added to a voyage is so much of the profits. Slocum was part owner of the vessel, and shrewdly alive to the value of the seaman. When about 300 miles south of Buenos Ayres, Wiley proposed that they should be landed there, from whence they might be transhipped to a vessel bound for home. This was objected to by Slocum on the ground that by such a deviation from his course he must lose 3 days, and the port dues at Buenos Ayres were heavy. Wiley undertook that the house of Wardlaw and Son should indemnify the brig for all expenses and losses incurred. Still the American hesitated. At last he honestly told Wiley he wished to keep the men. He liked them, they liked him. He had sounded them, and they had no objection to join his ship and sign articles for a 3 years' whaling voyage, provided they did not thereby forfeit their wages to which they would be entitled on reaching Liverpool. Wiley went forward and asked the men if they would take service with the Yankee captain. All but 3 expressed their desire to do so. These 3 had families in England, and refused. The mate gave the others a release, and an order on Wardlaw and Company for their full wages for the voyage. Then they signed articles with Captain Slocum, and entered the American mercantile navy. 2 days after this they sighted the high lands at the mouth of the Rio de la Plata at 10 p.m., and lay to for a pilot. After 3 hours' delay they were boarded by a pilot boat, and then began to creep into the port. The night was very dark, and a thin white fog lay on the water. Wiley was sitting on the taffrail and conversing with Slocum, when the lookout forward sung out, "Sail ho!" Another voice almost simultaneously yelled out of the fog, "Port your helm!" Suddenly, out of the mist, and close aboard the Maria, appeared the hull and canvas of a large ship. The brig was crossing her course, and her great bowsprit barely missed the brig's mainsail. It stood for a moment over Wiley's head. He looked up, and there was the figurehead of the ship looming almost within his reach. It was a colossal green woman. One arm extended grasped a golden harp, the other was pressed to her head in the attitude of holding back her wild and flowing hair. The face seemed to glare down upon the 2 men. In another moment the monster, gliding on, just missing the brig, was lost in the fog. "That was a narrow squeak," said Slocum. Wiley made no answer, but looked into the darkness after the vessel. He had recognized her figurehead. It was the Shannon. End of chapters 10 through 13.